Thank you to Aduck, Folkman, and probably others for requesting this episode. Welcome to Conlang Critic, the roughly annual show that gets facts wrong about your favorite conlang. I'm Jan Measley, and in this episode we'll be looking at the language of the people, Folkspraak. Folkspraak is a Germanic zonal auxlang that started its development in 1995 by market research consultant Jeffrey Henning, the creator of the now-defunct website langmaker.net. In 1999, Jeff created a Yahoo group for Folkspraak, and it became a collaboration. However, as the project continued, the collaborators began to disagree about what exactly the language should be like, and Folkspraak split off into various quote-unquote dialects, notably including Frankish, which was created by David Parka. The specific version I'll be looking at in this episode is called Diggisk Folkspraak, as described by Don Goedkoop in 2009, which I selected for its accessibility and because it's one of the only members of the Folkspraak family that calls itself Folkspraak. Folkspraak's consonants are m, n, ng, b, d, g, p, t, g, z, f, s, h, h, l, l, y, r. Or maybe it's r? It's kinda unclear what the rhotic is supposed to be. Anyway, one thing that stands out right away for this version of Folkspraak is the lack of dental fricatives. Since they appear in a handful of Germanic languages, a few versions of Folkspraak also include them, for recognizability's sake. This version chooses to leave them out, which is the right move in my opinion. It's worth noting that there's also a marginally phonetic palatal fricative, sh, which exists as an alternative pronunciation of the sequence ska. This makes some sense, as most Germanic languages don't actually have the ska cluster outside of loanwords, but in my opinion it would have been better to just go with a normal sh phoneme. Another strange inclusion is the voiced alveolar fricative. As you may know, the phonemic distinction between s and z is somewhat uncommon, and as far as I can tell, is absent from several North Germanic languages, including Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Faroese. Oh, and of course, there's the distinction between the velar and glottal fricatives. While the majority of Folkspraak source langs have at least some sort of h-like sound, it's a marginal phoneme at best in English, which is by far the most spoken Germanic language. Of course, these things can also go the other way, like in Flemish, which has a h sound but no h sound. The other nitpicks I have for this inventory are probably the result of Don writing the proposal for English-speaking non-linguists. Like, the velar nasal there is probably allowed to be pronounced as a nasal plus stop sequence, and that labiodental approximant may or may not actually be just a regular voiced labiodental fricative. I mean, between English V and W sure sounds like a labiodental approximant to me, but it could also be saying that it could be pronounced as either of those sounds in free variation. So, like, I don't know, most other versions of Folkspraak just have a regular V sound. The vowels are E, U, U, I, U, U, E, O, E, O, A. Diggisk Folkspraak suffers from a severe case of not defined using the IPA-itis. I mean, I'm sure Don has gotten better at linguistics in the past decade since writing this, so I'm not gonna dunk on him too hard here, but like, this is pretty inexcusable. The sound can be difficult to pronounce for English people. Linguists call it a rounded front vowel. To pronounce it, start with the short e, then round your lips, as if you would make the sound o, but keep your tongue in the same position. If you do that, you should hear yourself producing a proper sound. Like, hey buddy, that's not that's It's a completely different sound. Just for fun, here's what this vowel chart would look like if I took these helpful pronunciation guides completely at face value. Goofing aside, this is a rather straightforward Germanic vowel inventory. The schwa there only exists in unstressed syllables, which makes sense based on its distribution in Germanic langs. A couple of those long vowels are actually just allophones of their corresponding short vowels, specifically and u. In terms of compatibility, this system is fully compatible with languages like German, Swedish, and Danish. Other Germanic languages might not work perfectly, but most of them work at least okay enough that they can get by. That front rounded vowel there is absent from English, which is a problem, but like, not that big of a problem. It's a pretty distinctive sound, and it's not too difficult to learn how to make. Its commonality in other Germanic languages means it gets a pass. English speakers are fine, we can manage. The biggest compatibility issue across the board is the vowel length distinction. Speakers of languages like English, Icelandic, and Flemish can handle most of the long vowels, but don't really have a good equivalent for the long-short ah distinction. Fortunately, the long ah isn't actually a very hard sound to learn how to make, but it can in some cases be a hard sound to learn how to hear, which is just as important. Diggisk Folkspraak's orthography is relatively straightforward. It's meant to be intuitive for speakers of Germanic languages, and I think it works okay for that. It avoids diacritics, sticking entirely to the plain Latin alphabet, with the exception of a umlaut, which can also be written with the digraph AE. Of course, this letter isn't actually necessary, since since it produces the same sound as the letter E, so all it actually does is make it so you can't determine how a word is spelled from its pronunciation alone. Oh well. Speaking of pronunciation of loanwords from non-Germanic languages are more or less written and pronounced the same way as they are in their sources, even if the source language has sounds not present in Folkspraak. This could cause problems, but it does help to preserve recognizability. The grammar is, predictably, similar to how Germanic languages tend to work, but also predictably, heavily simplified. In general, Folkspraak uses the subject-verb-object-word order, but there are exceptions, such as for question marking. For example, Du skal de bok morgen op de berg moeten vinden means tomorrow you'll have to find the goat up the mountain, and Skal du de bok morgen op de berg moeten vinden means tomorrow will you have to find the goat up the mountain? Nouns work in a relatively simple way, which should be familiar to English speakers. Folkspraak nouns have no grammatical gender, which is for the best, and unlike many Germanic languages, there are only two cases, nominative and genitive. Other noun cases do exist, but they're only used for pronouns, which we'll get to later. Adjectives are pretty standard. They go before nouns and don't inflect for case or number or anything like that. Folkspraak has two articles, definite de and indefinite un. Just like adjectives, they're completely regular and don't inflect for anything, which is a huge relief to anyone who's tried to learn German. Unlike other parts of speech, verbs are relatively complex, though they are still simpler than those of a typical Germanic lang. The bare form of a verb is used as the simple present and imperative form, and suffixes exist for the infinitive, simple past, and participle past, the participle past being used for the perfect aspect. I personally don't think that it was completely necessary to have two separate suffixes for simple past and past participle, since that's not universal among the source langs. It really would have been fine to have the perfect aspect just be marked with the auxiliary verb alone, just like how all the other aspects are handled. For example, the auxiliary verb skal, which is primarily used for the future tense, can be inflected to be used in the conditional mood. It's worth noting that a handful of verbs are irregular in order to make their different forms more recognizable. Most notable is the copula, ar. While these irregularities could be confusing, I think it's fine for Folkspraak since its source languages consistently have these same inconsistencies. Unfortunately, Diggisk Folkspraak's full word list has been lost to time. Fortunately, as a native English speaker with a decent level of familiarity with multiple other Germanic languages, this means that reading through its medium-sized corpus is a pretty good test of how recognizable its words are for its target audience. My verdict is that, yes, these words are pretty recognizable. For example, a word like Woordboek can be easily compared to its corresponding words in German, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Afrikaans, and Norwegian, all of which mean, well, word book. Dictionary. Okay, let's talk pronouns. The pronouns are grammatically more complicated than the nouns, which is to be expected. Some of the borrowed asymmetry kinda bugs me, like how there isn't a distinct genitive form for the first person plural pronoun, and how the accusative and dative are only distinguished by the third person neuter pronoun. Disregarding that, this is an okay set of pronouns. It's pretty intuitive which one is which, with the strange exception of hen and hem, which sound very similar. All in all, I think Folkspraak is okay. At least the version I looked at is okay. There are many, many Folkspraaks I could have made this episode about instead, and they're all as different from each other as the Germanic languages they're based on. Diggisk Folkspraak met but didn't exceed my expectations. If the Folkspraak community was still active and decided to set a standard, I'm sure a more formalized form of this Folkspraak would serve the purpose of a Germanic zonal auxlang just as well as the other Folkspraaks I didn't look at as closely. Now, actually comparing it directly to the other interlangs I've reviewed is a little strange. Unlike the other international languages I've ranked, Folkspraak has a very limited scope. Within this limited scope, I think it more or less achieves what it set out to do, but no aspect of it really stands out as being exceptionally elegantly designed. That in mind, I'd say that I like Folkspraak more than I like Edo, but not as much as I like Lingua Franca Nova, making it the third best interlang reviewed so far. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, where I'll be reviewing... Oh, looks like we've gotten through the small list. Dang, it's been almost 2 years since the last time that happened. Well then, without further ado,